Sitting in my office here, I thought it'd be fun to provide a little running commentary on one of the Bible's most delicious little narrative stories in the book of Genesis, of many options, namely the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. Doesn't seem so bad. And as they migrated from the east, east, as you know, probably if you've been reading through the Torah, reading Genesis, east is a kind of a code word for maybe like not the direction that is closer to God. Why? Well, in the Garden of Eden story, Adam and Eve, they're kicked out with an angel guarding the way and they can't get back in and they go out toward the east. Later, when Cain commits the first murder in Genesis chapter 4, as humanity degrades, he is sent out and banished even further east of Eden. Now we have people pushing further into the east. What is all this east kind of stuff? Well, in the ancient Israelite cosmic geography, spatiality, the very language shows us that we're to imagine the ancient Israelite person standing and actually facing east with their back toward the Mediterranean Sea. So that's west. And then your right hand is kind of like facing south, because the word for right hand in Hebrew is the same word for south. And then your left hand is actually facing north. So there's a kind of an orientation toward the east, interestingly encoded there in that language. And as people go east, of course, I mean, literally in the geography, what is east of Israel, straight across the desert there or along the path of the Fertile Crescent, but the great empires of the ancient Near Eastern world, the Assyrians, or most relevant to this story, the Babylonians, right? Where later then in the story, in chapter 12 and then beyond, where are Avram and Sarai, or later Abraham and Sarah, where are they called from? They are in the east, and they're called to come back to the west, right? So there's almost a sense that this eastward direction is a direction of distance from God and of sin, but then the return west is a direction back home, back to the Garden of Eden, symbolically, we might say. And in fact, we will see, spoiler alert, in Israel's story, that their actions, their sins, drive them from God to the point where by the time we get to the book of 2 Kings, God decides enough and allows the people to be destroyed by the Babylonians, who come in and deport some portion of the population, not everybody, but some influential portion of the population, from their land all the way to the east. But then later, when the Persian king Cyrus comes in and offers them the way back home to rebuild the temple, around the year 539 BCE, which they may be accomplished by the year 515 BCE. Which direction are they then going to return home? This would be like the book of Ezra, for example. They're going from the east back to the west. So this east-west thing is a thing. So if you notice that, you're right to notice that. And here, the tone is already ominous as the people are migrating from the east. Really, the NRSV says from the east, but the phrase could just as well be understood, and probably should be understood, I think, better as eastward, to the east, right? That makes symbolic sense of the space. And they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar. Shinar, where Shinar, earlier Genesis 10 had identified Shinar with something like the place where Babylon is. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Brick and mortar. I don't know if we're supposed to think that people are inventing brick making here for the first time or what. But this exact pairing of the phrases in Hebrew for brick and for mortar are actually very, very specifically repeated in Exodus chapter 1 to describe the kind of brick and mortar process that the Hebrew slaves will engage in. So we have some sense in the language here, some kind of callback or resonance to brick making as something that empires do. Empires do brick making, and maybe you have enslaved people doing that, and there's something maybe a little murky in all this brick making, And they said famously, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower with its top in the heavens." What about this building of cities too? It's like, what kind of cities have we even seen at this point in the biblical narrative? Not many. City life in the biblical worldview, yes, there were cities. Jerusalem was a city and so on, but cities in Genesis 1 through 11 are sort of associated with problems. I mean, the Bible takes something of a dim view of cities in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament. I love cities. And I'm not sure that that's like a teaching that we're being offered necessarily, but in this context, for instance, Cain becomes one of the first city builders. It's not said that that makes it a problem just on its own, but you're kind of left to wonder. In other places, you have the great building of the cities as the nations develop in Genesis 1 through 11, and the Assyrians are big city builders. They turn out to be a major biblical villain, the Assyrians, for lots of reasons. So more ominous. Do you see how the story is maybe building an ominous tone through code words that a reader who's attuned to the literature would be like, uh-oh, 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 it just kind of keeps building, right? A tower with its top in the heavens. I can remember being a child and hearing this story, maybe like in a Sunday school setting, and thinking like, how would that structurally work? Like, were these people just like dumb and they thought that the tower would really reach that high, or is it that kind of arrogance, or what's really going on here? Not totally clear. There are kind of two ways maybe that I could offer an entryway into this for you. One is to think of a Mesopotamian religious structure. The Babylonians were very famous for it in various periods, called the ziggurat. Ziggurat. I'll put a link down below and you can look at an example of a ziggurat and how people have maybe connected it to this story. The idea of a ziggurat is it's like a pyramidal kind of structure, a kind of a tower, and the top room is like a special place where maybe a certain kind of sacrifice or ritual is conducted. It's a place of communion with the gods, right? So maybe this idea, the story, one way to read this whole story is that it's a kind of a satire on the idea of a ziggurat or of a Babylonian religious structure or a temple of a certain kind. So that's the idea of the top in the heavens. Another way into this is to think of Genesis chapter 28, where you have Jacob is going down the road and he stops and he dreams at night at Bethel, and he sees a famous vision of a stairway or a ladder that goes up to heaven, which has its top, Rosh, same language, in the heavens, Shemayim in Hebrew. So there's a little bit of a parallel there then made with this attempt to build something with its top in the heavens, and then some other kind of structure, God's own structure, this ladder or this stairway with which he communicates with Jacob. So there's a kind of a callback there to that idea. But what of this idea that somehow this is a satire of Babylonian religion? I mean, famously, this story is called the Tower of Babel, right? Verse 9. Therefore, God comes down, scatters the people. This doesn't work. Therefore, it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. So you have wordplay. The word Babel in Hebrew is bavel, and the word for confused, the verb is balal. So bavel, balal, these are two words that kind of, that their letters are kind of mixed up and close to each other. So the author's doing a wordplay. But the word Babel in Hebrew is the word Babylon. That's the word. That is the Hebrew word for Babylon, is Babel. That's the word. So the authors aren't being very subtle here about the fact that they are identifying and critiquing something that they're calling Babylon. So this idea of the ziggurat as the Babylonian religious structure, and this idea of the Babylonians being famous builders, is maybe something we could think about here. I mean, of course, scholars who dig very deep into authorship levels and layers, a very complicated thing, will often say that a story like this might have been written during a period or inspired by a period when Israel was living in close contact with the Babylonians, namely like during that exile I mentioned earlier, sometime between 586 and 530 BC, let's just say, to choose dates there. And that a story like this speaks as much to, an etiological function, why do people speak different languages, or what happened in ancient history, or something like that, speaks as much to a kind of contemporary situation for the author and to a major symbolic meaning about the outcome of the major projects of the world's great empires. God's not a fan and comes down to mix them up. One more callback that we might see, or call forward and call back, is with this thing that the people want to do. What's their goal in verse 4? Come, let us build ourselves a city with and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name, Shem, for ourselves, a name. That same word, Shem, can also mean fame or a legacy or something like that. They want to build that for themselves very, very directly. However, in the very next chapter, chapter 12, the turn toward Abraham and Sarah, or at this point, Abram and Sarai, God's command, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house. This is Genesis 12:1. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your Shem, your name. I'll make your name great so that you will be a blessing. People try to make a name for themselves. God says no. God will give the name. They try to build a tower with its top in the heaven. God says no. I'll give you my ladder, my stairway with its top in the heaven, right? So you see these kinds of contrasts being made with the story. I'll also mention a fun literary structure that's being employed in this story that people have often noticed, and I'll put a link down below to this visually, because it is kind of a visual thing. It's hard to describe, but if you look at it, I think it'll make sense. It's called the chiastic structure. Chiasm is a literary structure where you start with a statement, then you make another statement, like A, B, and then C, which is like in the middle, and then you kind of backtrack. B, and then A, where you're kind of repeating echoes of the first statement. So A is like using a certain phrase, then B, then C, a statement in the middle which stands without parallel. And then you kind of back out of it by repeating some elements of the earlier story. So it's almost like this kind of like sideways pyramid kind of thing. The entire story, this entire narrative of Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, functions like a very sophisticated chiasm. And in fact, there are other really, really intricate chiasms that would have taken a lot of literary effort, a lot of intentional literary effort to pull off. Like in Genesis 6 through 9, the whole flood story can actually be read as a giant chiasm. So if you look at that link I have down below, you can see kind of how I've mapped this out. This is a page from a book that I wrote, a commentary on Genesis, where you can kind of see some of these phrases and the way that the author walks us into that literary structure that was very important for people for thinking about meaning and maybe just a kind of a pleasing way to tell a story.